year is 3.4 million BC. The place, the Afar region of what we now call Ethiopia. You've just witnessed something that will change the course of human history forever, but you don't know it yet. In fact, you can't know it, because you're not quite human as we understand the term today. You're something else entirely, something caught between the world of apes and the world that's coming. Picture this scene. The African sun beats down mercilessly on a landscape that looks nothing like the Ethiopia of today. Dense woodlands stretch as far as the eye can see, broken by meandering rivers and vast lake systems that will vanish long before the first pyramid rises from Egyptian sand. The air hums with insects you've never heard of, and somewhere in the distance, a saber-toothed cat lets out a roar that makes your spine tingle with ancient fear. And there you are, standing upright on two legs, but not quite like we do. Your arms hang longer, your brain sits smaller in your skull, and your face juts forward in ways that would make you unrecognizable to any modern human. You're Australopithecus afarensis, though of course you don't know that name. You don't have names for anything yet, because you don't have language as we understand it. But today, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will echo through 3.5 million years of history and fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. You're about to become the first creature on this planet to deliberately modify a rock with the specific intention of making it more useful. You're about to invent technology. Now I know what you're thinking. Stone tools? That's it? That's what we're calling the birth of technology? Where are the smartphones, the rocket ships, the artificial intelligence systems that can write poetry and solve mathematical theorems? Well, here's the thing. Every single piece of technology you've ever used, from the pencil in your hand to the computer you're watching this on, can trace its lineage back to this moment. Back to you, standing in that ancient Ethiopian woodland, staring at a rock and seeing not just a rock, but possibility. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about stones and bones and archaeological digs, though there's plenty of that. It's about the precise moment when intelligence became intentional, when survival became innovation, when a species that had been reacting to the world around it suddenly began reshaping that world to suit its needs. It's the story of how we went from being just another animal struggling to get by to becoming the only species on Earth capable of fundamentally altering the planet itself. But to understand this moment, we need to travel back even further. We need to understand what life was like before that first tool was ever struck. We need to understand the world that created the necessity for innovation and the remarkable series of evolutionary adaptations that made such innovation possible in the first place. The Afar region of Ethiopia, 3.4 million years ago, was a place of abundance and terror in equal measure. The climate was warmer and more humid than today, supporting vast forests that teemed with life. But this wasn't the peaceful Disney movie version of nature. This was nature red in tooth and claw, where every day was a calculated gamble between finding food and becoming food. Your species, Australopithecus afarensis, had already made one of the most significant evolutionary leaps in the history of life on Earth. Somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago, your ancestors had made a decision that seemed almost suicidal at the time. They had climbed down from the safety of the trees and begun walking upright on the dangerous ground below. This wasn't a sudden change. Evolution doesn't work that way. It was a gradual process that took millions of years, driven by environmental pressures we're still trying to fully understand. As Africa's climate began to change, as forests gave way to more open woodlands and grasslands, some of our ancestors found advantages in being able to walk upright. They could see over tall grass to spot predators and prey. They could cover long distances more efficiently, and perhaps most importantly, they freed up their hands for other tasks. But walking upright came with costs, massive costs. Your pelvis had to completely restructure itself, creating complications in childbirth that persist to this day. Your spine developed curves that made back problems inevitable. You became slower than your four-legged cousins, less agile in the trees, more vulnerable on the open ground. And yet, despite these disadvantages, bipedalism persisted. It thrived. It became the defining characteristic of your lineage. Why? Because it set the stage for something even more revolutionary. It set the stage for the moment we're building toward, when you would pick up that first stone and begin the long journey towards civilization. Life for Australopithecus afarensis was a constant struggle against overwhelming odds. Every morning began the same way, with a careful assessment of threats and opportunities. The nights were the worst, when the darkness filled with sounds that made your heart race and your muscles tense. The roar of lions, the whooping calls of hyenas, the rustling in the bushes that could be anything from a harmless rodent to a leopard sizing you up for its next meal. Your group, maybe 15 or 20 individuals, had spent the night huddled together in whatever shelter you could find. Maybe it was a rocky outcrop that provided some protection from the wind and rain. Maybe it was a grove of trees, thick enough to discourage most predators. Shelter was temporary, always temporary, because you were nomads by necessity, following the rhythms of food and water across a landscape that could turn hostile without warning. As dawn broke, the real work began. Food gathering was a group effort that required every member to contribute. The children, even the youngest who could walk, learned to spot the signs of edible plants, to recognize which fruits were ripe, which roots could be safely dug up and consumed. The adults spread out in a careful pattern, never straying too far from each other, always maintaining visual contact, always ready to sound the alarm if danger approached. Your diet was varied but precarious. Fruits when you could find them, seeds, nuts, tubers dug from the hard ground with your bare hands and simple digging sticks. Occasionally, meat, but not in the way you might imagine. You weren't hunters, not yet. You were scavengers, following the sounds of kills made by more capable predators, waiting for your chance to dart in and claim whatever scraps remained after the lions and hyenas had taken their fill. This scavenging was dangerous work that required split-second timing and incredible courage. You had to read the subtle signs that told you when a predator had finished feeding and moved away, when the coast was clear for a quick raid on the carcass. Too early, and you'd find yourself face to face with a saber-toothed cat that saw you as dessert. Too late, and there would be nothing left but bones picked clean by insects and smaller scavengers. But here's where things get interesting. Even 3.5 million years ago, you weren't content to simply accept whatever scraps nature provided. You were already showing signs of the innovative thinking that would define your species. When you found a carcass, you didn't just grab what you could and run, you studied it. You looked for ways to extract more nutrition, more value from what remained. The marrow inside bones was rich in fat and nutrients, but it was locked away behind barriers of calcium that your teeth couldn't penetrate. The brain tissue was highly nutritious, but it was protected by a skull that seemed impenetrable. These were problems that demanded solutions, and slowly, gradually, you began to develop those solutions. At first, they were simple adaptations of existing behaviors. You learned that certain rocks were harder than others, that they could be used to crack open bones if you struck them with enough force. You discovered that some stones had sharp edges that could cut through hide and sinew more effectively than your fingernails. These weren't tools in the sense we understand them today. They were opportunistic uses of available materials, natural objects pressed into service when the need arose. But something remarkable was happening in your brain during these moments of problem solving. Neural pathways were forming, strengthening, becoming more complex with each successful innovation. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning and abstract thinking, was slowly expanding, developing new capabilities that would eventually set your species apart from every other form of life on Earth. The breakthrough, when it came, probably seemed insignificant at the time. You were crouched beside a stream, trying to crack open a particularly stubborn bone to reach the marrow inside. The rocks you had been using weren't working. They were either too soft, crumbling under the impact, or too smooth, slipping in your grip and failing to deliver enough force. But then you noticed something. One of the rocks had broken during your attempts, and the break had created a sharp, straight edge that looked different from anything you had seen in nature. It looked purposeful. It looked designed. And in that moment, something clicked in your brain. A connection formed between cause and effect, between intention and result, that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. You picked up another rock, examined it carefully, and then, with deliberate intent, struck it against a harder surface. The impact sent shockwaves through the stone, creating fractures that followed predictable patterns determined by the rock's internal structure. Pieces flaked away, revealing fresh surfaces, sharp edges, pointed tips that seemed almost too perfect to be accidental. This was the moment. This was the birth of technology. Not the accidental use of a naturally occurring tool, but the deliberate modification of raw materials to create something that didn't exist in nature. Something designed for a specific purpose. Something that extended your natural capabilities and gave you power over your environment that no creature had ever possessed before. The implications of this moment would take millions of years to fully unfold, but the foundation was laid right there, beside that ancient Ethiopian stream. You had crossed a threshold that separated you forever from the rest of the animal kingdom. You had become a maker of tools, a shaper of the world around you, a creature capable of imagining possibilities that didn't yet exist and then bringing them into reality through skill and intention. The rock in your hands looked simple enough. Volcanic basalt, hard and fine-grained, common throughout the region. But what you were about to do with it would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to agriculture, to cities, to written language, to space travel, to the very video you're watching right now. Every human achievement, every technological breakthrough, every moment of creative innovation can trace its roots back to this instant when you first realized that the world didn't have to remain exactly as you found it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The story of how that first crude stone tool eventually became a smartphone or a rocket engine is a tale for later episodes. Right now, we need to understand exactly what happened in that moment, how your brain processed this revolutionary concept, and why this particular innovation succeeded, where countless others had failed throughout the long history of life on Earth. The process of creating that first intentional tool wasn't as simple as picking up a rock and hitting it with another rock. What you were doing required a level of cognitive sophistication that scientists are still trying to fully understand today. You had to visualize the end result before you began. Imagine how the forces of impact would travel through the stone, predict where the fractures would occur, and adjust your technique based on feedback from each strike. This is what archaeologists call the chaîne opératoire, the operational sequence of toolmaking. It's a mental blueprint that exists entirely in your mind, passed down not through genetic inheritance, but through observation, practice, and teaching. You had to understand the properties of different types of stone, recognize which rocks would flake predictably, and which would simply crumble or refuse to break at all. Basalt was good for some purposes, its fine grain allowing for sharp, precise edges. Obsidian, when you could find it, was even better, capable of producing edges sharper than modern surgical steel. Quartzite was durable but harder to work, requiring more force and producing less predictable results. Each material demanded its own approach, its own technique, its own understanding of how force and angle and timing combine to produce the desired outcome. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. You weren't just learning to make tools, you were learning to teach others to make tools. The knowledge wasn't dying with you when your time ended. It was being passed along, refined, improved upon by the next generation and the generation after that. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, information was being transmitted culturally rather than just genetically. Watch a modern chimpanzee using a stick to extract termites from a mound, and you'll see tool use. But you won't see tool manufacture in the sense we're discussing. The chimp might modify the stick slightly, stripping away leaves or shortening it to fit into the termite holes. But they're not fundamentally altering the material structure. They're not imposing a completely new form onto raw materials through planned sequences of actions. What you were doing was different, revolutionary. You were taking a piece of the natural world and reshaping it according to a vision that existed only in your mind. You were creating something that had never existed before. Something that couldn't exist without intelligent intervention. You were becoming, in the truest sense of the word, a creator. The social implications were just as significant as the technological ones. Toolmaking became a group activity, something that brought your small band together around shared knowledge and common purpose. The best toolmakers became valuable members of the group, their skills ensuring better access to food, more efficient processing of carcasses, improved defense against predators and competitors. Knowledge became currency. The individual who could consistently produce the sharpest cutting edges, the most effective scrapers, the most durable choppers, gained status within the group. They became teachers, passing their techniques to younger members who gathered around to watch and learn. This was the beginning of expertise, of specialization, of the complex social structures that would eventually give rise to civilization itself. But let's not romanticize this process. Life 3.5 million years ago was still brutally difficult, even with these new tools. The mortality rate was staggering. Most individuals didn't survive to adulthood. Those who did faced constant threats from predators, disease, starvation, and violence from competing groups of their own species. Your tools were crude by any modern standard. Simple choppers and scrapers that would have seemed laughably primitive to a human living even 500,000 years later. But they worked. They gave you an edge in the relentless struggle for survival. They allowed you to process food more efficiently, to defend yourself more effectively, to adapt to new environments and challenges in ways that would have been impossible without them. The ripple effects spread quickly through your population. Groups with better tools had access to more nutrition, could process carcasses more completely, could crack open bones that others had to abandon. They grew stronger, more numerous, more successful in competition with their neighbors. Natural selection began favoring not just physical traits like strength and speed, but cognitive abilities like planning, problem solving, and innovation. This created a feedback loop that would drive human evolution for millions of years to come. Better brains led to better tools. Better tools led to better nutrition and higher survival rates. Higher survival rates meant more opportunities for learning and cultural transmission. And so, the cycle continued. Each generation building upon the achievements of the last, pushing the boundaries of what was possible ever further outward. The landscape itself began to change in response to your innovations. Sites where good tool-making stone could be found became gathering places, seasonal camps where multiple groups would converge to trade, to learn from each other, to share techniques and innovations. These were humanity's first workshops, the earliest examples of what we might recognize as centers of learning and technological development. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these sites were used repeatedly over thousands of years, accumulating layers of stone chips and broken tools that tell the story of gradual improvement and refinement. The crude choppers of the to transport tools over considerable distances, carrying earliest layers, gave way to more sophisticated implements to flaking patterns. You were also beginning with carefully planned, striking platforms and precisely control, particularly well-made implements with you as you moved across the landscape. This suggests not just immediate problem-solving ability, but forward planning, the capacity to anticipate future needs and prepare for them in advance. It's a cognitive leap that seems simple until you consider that no other species on Earth demonstrates this level of foresight and planning. The tools themselves were starting to diversify. What began as general-purpose choppers and scrapers gradually evolved into more specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Heavy-duty choppers for breaking bones, sharp-edged scrapers for processing hides, pointed tools for digging up roots and tubers. Each new design represented a deeper understanding of the relationship between form and function, between the shape of a tool and its effectiveness at accomplishing particular tasks. But perhaps most remarkably, you were beginning to make tools to make other tools. Secondary tools that existed not to directly solve problems of food acquisition or defense, but to improve the process of tool-making itself. Hammer stones carefully selected for their hardness and grip. Anvils chosen for their stability and resistance to breaking under impact. This is abstract thinking of the highest order. The ability to see connections between cause and effect across multiple levels of complexity. The neurological changes required to support this level of cognitive sophistication were profound. Your brain was reorganizing itself, developing new neural pathways and strengthening existing ones. The areas responsible for fine motor control were expanding to accommodate the precise hand movements required for effective stone knapping. The regions associated with spatial reasoning were becoming more complex, better able to visualize three-dimensional relationships and predict the outcomes of specific actions. Language, though still primitive by modern standards, was becoming more sophisticated as well. You needed words for different types of stone, for various tool-making techniques, for the qualities that made one implement more effective than another. The vocabulary of technology was being born alongside the technology itself, creating new ways of thinking about the world and your place within it. The social dynamics of your group were evolving too. Toolmaking created new forms of cooperation and competition. Skilled craftspeople formed partnerships, sharing techniques and resources. Apprenticeships developed as younger members of the group sought instruction from their elders. Trade relationships emerged as groups with access to high-quality stone exchanged raw materials and finished tools with neighbors who controlled other valuable resources. These early tool-making communities were laying the groundwork for all the complex social structures that would follow. The division of labor, the specialization of skills, the development of expertise, the creation of value through transformation of raw materials, all of these fundamental economic concepts can be traced back to those first intentional modifications of stone beside ancient Ethiopian streams. Yet for all these advances, you remained profoundly vulnerable. A single drought could devastate your population. A volcanic eruption could bury your homeland under layers of ash. Climate change could transform your familiar woodlands into hostile grasslands where your survival strategies no longer applied. The tools that gave you such an advantage over other species were still primitive enough that they provided only the thinnest margin between life and death. But that margin was enough to ensure that your innovations would survive, that they would spread, that they would continue to evolve and improve with each passing generation. The foundation had been laid for everything that would follow, from the conquest of fire to the development of agriculture, from the rise of cities to the exploration of space. Standing there beside that ancient stream, chipping away at volcanic rock with patient determination, you couldn't have imagined where this path would lead. You were simply trying to solve an immediate problem, to access the nutritious marrow locked inside animal bones. But in doing so, you had taken the first step on a journey that would ultimately transform not just your species, but the entire planet. The age of technology had begun. The reverberations of that first deliberate strike would ripple outward through time in ways you couldn't possibly comprehend. But in the immediate aftermath, as you held that newly shaped piece of basalt in your hands, Something fundamental had shifted in your relationship with the world around you. The rock was no longer just a rock. It had become an extension of your will, a physical manifestation of your ability to impose order on chaos. Your fingers traced the sharp edge you had created, and your brain processed sensory information in entirely new ways. The texture of the stone, the weight distribution, the angle of the cutting surface, all of these details were being catalogued and stored for future reference. You were building a mental library of cause and effect, action and result that would inform every future attempt at tool creation. The other members of your group had gathered around during your work, drawn by the rhythmic sound of stone striking stone. They watched with fascination as you tested your creation, using it to slice through the tough hide of a scavenged carcass with an efficiency that their fingernails and teeth could never match. The demonstration was more powerful than any words could have been. Here was proof that the world could be changed, that problems could be solved through ingenuity and persistence. But learning to replicate your achievement wasn't simple for the observers. They could see what you had accomplished, but understanding how you had accomplished it required a different kind of thinking altogether. They had to move beyond simple imitation to genuine comprehension, grasping not just the mechanical process of striking stone against stone, but the underlying principles that governed which strikes would succeed and which would fail. This is where the true revolution began to unfold. Knowledge that had previously existed only in your individual mind started to become communal property. The process was slow and often frustrating. Many attempts ended in failure, with promising pieces of stone shattered beyond use by poorly aimed strikes or excessive force. But with each failure came learning, and with each success came growing confidence in the possibility of mastery. Your role within the group began to evolve as well. No longer were you simply another forager competing for resources and status. You had become something new, a keeper of specialized knowledge, whose skills provided benefits for the entire community. When disputes arose over access to the best scavenging sites or the most productive fruit trees, your voice carried additional weight because your tools made everyone more successful. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. For the first time in your species' history, individual achievement could be measured by something other than physical prowess or social dominance. Intelligence, creativity, and technical skill became valuable commodities that could elevate status within the group hierarchy. The nerdy kid who was good with rocks suddenly became as important as the strongest hunter or the most charismatic leader. This shift toward valuing cognitive abilities would prove to be one of the most significant evolutionary pressures your species had ever encountered. Natural selection began favoring not just those who could run fast or fight well, but those who could think creatively, solve complex problems, and innovate under pressure. The human brain, already larger and more complex than that of any other primate, began an accelerated period of growth and development that would continue for millions of years. The tools themselves were becoming more sophisticated with remarkable speed. What had started as simple choppers and scrapers evolved into implements with carefully planned proportions and meticulously crafted edges. You were learning to read the internal structure of different stones, to predict how force would travel through crystalline matrices, to anticipate where fractures would occur and how they could be controlled. Regional variations began to emerge as different groups developed their own approaches to toolmaking. Communities near volcanic regions favored obsidian and basalt, learning to work with these materials' unique properties. Groups in areas rich in sedimentary rock developed techniques suited to sandstone and limestone. Each environment demanded its own innovations, its own solutions to the fundamental challenge of imposing human will upon natural materials. Trade networks started to form around these regional specializations. A group with access to particularly high-quality flint might exchange finished tools or raw materials with neighbors who controlled sources of ochre for body painting or salt for food preservation. These early economic relationships were creating the first threads of connection between distant communities, laying the groundwork for the complex web of trade and cultural exchange that would eventually span continents. The social implications extended far beyond simple resource sharing. As groups came together to trade, they also shared knowledge, techniques, and innovations. A particularly effective tool design could spread across vast distances through these networks, refined and adapted by each community that encountered it. Cultural evolution was accelerating, driven by the same competitive pressures that had always shaped biological evolution, but operating on much shorter timescales. Your daily routine was being transformed by these technological advances. Tasks that had once consumed hours could now be accomplished in minutes. Bones that had previously been abandoned as inaccessible sources of nutrition could be cracked open with ease. Tough plant fibers could be processed more efficiently, yielding materials for simple cordage and binding. The caloric return on your foraging efforts was increasing dramatically, providing more energy for other activities. This surplus energy didn't go to waste. With basic survival needs being met more efficiently, you had time and resources to invest in other pursuits. Experimentation with new tool designs became possible. Extended exploration of the landscape revealed new sources of raw materials and food resources. Social interactions became more complex as groups had leisure time for activities beyond immediate survival needs. The concept of planning was expanding beyond the immediate future to encompass longer-term goals and strategies. You began to anticipate seasonal changes, preparing tools and resources in advance for predictable challenges. Winter camps were established at sites with reliable water sources and natural shelter. Summer foraging routes were planned to take advantage of fruit ripening schedules and animal migration patterns. Your spatial awareness was becoming more sophisticated as well. The landscape was no longer just a collection of resources and hazards to be navigated day by day. It was becoming a mental map of interconnected locations, each with its own seasonal characteristics and strategic advantages. Tool-making sites, water sources, shelter locations, and food-rich areas were all being catalogued and remembered with increasing precision. The process of creating tools was itself becoming ritualized and systematic. Raw materials were carefully selected and stockpiled. Work areas were prepared with anvil stones and knapping platforms arranged for maximum efficiency. The sequence of strikes required to produce specific tool types was being refined through countless repetitions, each craftsperson developing their own subtle variations and improvements. Quality control was emerging as skilled toolmakers learned to recognize and discard inferior implements. A scraper with an irregular edge or a chopper with internal flaws would be abandoned in favor of better alternatives. Standards were rising as experience taught the difference between adequate tools and truly effective ones. The concept of craftsmanship was being born, along with the pride and satisfaction that comes from creating something truly well made. But perhaps most remarkably, you were beginning to develop patience. Tools that were not only functional, but also an aesthetic sense about your creasing to look at and satisfying to hold, were being preferred over purely utilitarian alternatives. Symmetry, balance, and elegant proportions were becoming valued qualities that went beyond mere mechanical effectiveness. This emergence of aesthetic appreciation represented another cognitive leap of staggering significance. You were developing the capacity to find beauty in human-made objects, to appreciate form for its own sake, rather than purely for its function. The seeds of art, of creative expression, of the human drive to create beauty, were being planted alongside the more practical innovations of tool technology. The neurological changes supporting these developments were profound and far-reaching. Brain regions associated with fine motor control were expanding and becoming more sophisticated. Areas responsible for spatial reasoning and three-dimensional visualization were developing new capabilities. The neural networks that would eventually support language were being strengthened through the complex cognitive demands of toolmaking and teaching. Memory systems were evolving to handle the increasing complexity of technical knowledge. The details of different stone types, the sequences of actions required for various tool designs, the locations of raw material sources, all of this information had to be stored, organized, and retrieved when needed. Your brain was becoming a sophisticated database of practical knowledge that could be accessed and updated throughout your lifetime. The social transmission of this knowledge was creating the first human institutions. Master craftspeople and their apprentices formed relationships that extended beyond simple family bonds. Knowledge was being preserved and passed down through generations, creating continuity of tradition that transcended individual lifespans. The foundation was being laid for all the complex educational and cultural institutions that would follow. Competition between groups was intensifying as the advantages provided by superior tool technology became more apparent. Communities, the psychological impact of tool. This created pressure for continuous innovation and improvement. Driving them with better implements could process resources more efficiently, defend themselves more effectively, and expand into new territories with greater success. Pace of technological development, ever faster making, extended deep into your sense of identity and place in the world. You were no longer simply a creature subject to the whims of nature and circumstance. You had become an agent of change, capable of reshaping your environment to better suit your needs. The feeling of power and control that came with this realization was intoxicating and transformative. Your relationship with other species was changing as well. Animals that had once been competitors or threats were increasingly being seen as resources to be exploited through superior technology. The tools that allowed you to process carcasses more efficiently also made you a more formidable competitor at kill sites, able to drive off scavengers that would have been dangerous adversaries in earlier times. The ecological impact of your innovations was still minimal but growing. Concentrated tool-making activities were beginning to alter local landscapes, creating distinctive archaeological signatures that would persist for millions of years. Stone chips and broken implements were accumulating at favored work sites, creating the first human-made geological formations. These changes were laying the groundwork for even more dramatic transformations to come. The cognitive abilities and social structures that emerged from early tool-making would eventually support the conquest of fire, the development of language, the creation of art, and ultimately, the rise of civilization itself. But for now, standing beside that ancient Ethiopian stream with a carefully crafted piece of stone in your hands, you were simply focused on the immediate task at hand. The sun was setting on another day in the Pliocene epoch, but it was also dawning on a new age in the history of life on Earth. The age of technology had truly begun, and there would be no turning back. Every choice you made, every innovation you developed, every piece of knowledge you passed along to future generations was contributing to a transformation that would eventually reshape not just your species, but the entire planet. The journey from that first intentional tool to the complex civilization of today would take millions of years and countless generations of gradual improvement and innovation. But the foundation had been laid, the precedent established, the path forward illuminated by the spark of human creativity and ingenuity that had been kindled beside an ancient African stream 3.5 million years ago. You're standing there as the shadows lengthen, turning that worked stone over in your hands, but you have no idea that you've just crossed the most significant threshold in the history of consciousness itself. The weight of the tool feels different now, not just as an object, but as something that extends your very being into the world around you. Your fingers have memorized every ridge, every angle, every surface that your deliberate strikes have created. But here's what's truly remarkable about this moment. You're not just holding a tool, you're holding the future. Every smartphone that will ever ping with a notification, every rocket that will ever pierce the atmosphere, every work of art that will ever move someone to tears, they all begin right here, right now, with your calloused fingers wrapped around a piece of modified stone. The other members of your group are still watching, still trying to understand what they've witnessed. Some of them are already searching the ground for suitable stones of their own, driven by an instinct they can't yet articulate. They want to replicate what you've done, but more than that, they want to improve upon it. Competition is brewing, not the violent competition for resources that had defined your species up to this point, but something entirely new. Intellectual competition. Creative competition. The race to innovate. What you don't realize is that your brain is literally rewiring itself in real time. Neural pathways that had never existed before are forming as you process the relationship between intention and outcome, between vision and execution. The prefrontal cortex, that remarkable region responsible for planning and abstract thought, is laying down new connections at a rate that would astound modern neuroscientists. Your motor cortex is adapting as well, developing the fine-grained control necessary for precise stone napping. The coordination required to strike at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force, while maintaining the proper grip on both the core stone and the hammer, involves neural calculations of staggering complexity. Your brain is becoming a biological computer optimized for the manipulation of the physical world. But the changes go deeper than just motor control and planning. Your capacity for mental modeling is expanding exponentially. You're developing the ability to hold complex, three-dimensional images in your mind, to rotate them, modify them, test different approaches without ever touching a physical object. This is the birth of human imagination in its most practical form, the power to envision possibilities that don't yet exist and then work systematically to bring them into reality. The ripple effects of this cognitive revolution are already beginning to spread through your small community. Knowledge that was once locked inside individual minds is becoming shared property, transmitted through observation, imitation, and the earliest forms of instruction. You find yourself becoming a teacher, though you don't have words for that concept yet. You demonstrate techniques, correct mistakes, share insights about which types of stone work best for different purposes. This teaching process is reshaping the social structure of your group in profound ways. Traditionally, status had been determined by physical strength, by access to mates, by dominance hierarchies that were familiar to any social primate. But now, a new form of status was emerging based on knowledge, skill, and the ability to innovate. The individual who could consistently produce the sharpest edges, the most durable tools, the most efficient designs was becoming valuable to the group in ways that transcended simple physical competition. Your daily routine is transforming as these new tools prove their worth again and again. A carcass that would have taken hours to process with teeth and fingernails can now be efficiently butchered in minutes. Bones that were previously impenetrable fortresses, protecting valuable marrow and brain tissue, now yield their treasures to your stone implements. The caloric return on your scavenging efforts has increased dramatically, providing surplus energy that can be invested in other activities. This energy surplus is crucial because it's creating the first leisure time in human history. For the first time, members of your species have moments when they're not desperately focused on immediate survival needs. These precious intervals of relative security are being filled with experimentation, with play, with the kind of curious exploration that drives innovation. You find yourself napping stones not because you need more tools immediately, but because the process itself is becoming intrinsically rewarding. The landscape around you is beginning to take on new meaning as your tool-making activities create the first human-modified environments. Favorite napping sites are accumulating piles of stone chips and broken implements, creating distinctive signatures that will persist in the archaeological record for millions of years. These locations are becoming gathering places where multiple individuals work side by side, sharing techniques and competing to produce superior implements. Regional variations are starting to emerge as different groups develop their own approaches to tool making. Communities near volcanic regions are specializing in working with obsidian and basalt, learning the unique properties of these materials and developing techniques optimized for their characteristics. Groups in sedimentary regions are focusing on sandstone and chert, creating entirely different technological traditions suited to their local resources. These regional specializations are driving the formation of the first trade networks in human history. A group with access to particularly high-quality stone might exchange raw materials or finished tools with neighbors who control other valuable resources. These early economic relationships are creating connections between distant communities that extend far beyond simple territorial boundaries. The process of making tools is becoming increasingly ritualized and systematic. Raw materials are being carefully evaluated and stockpiled according to quality and intended use. Work areas are being prepared with anvil stones, positioned for optimal angles and striking platforms arranged for maximum efficiency. The entire sequence of tool production is being refined through countless repetitions, with each craftsperson developing their own subtle variations and improvements. Quality standards are rising as experience teaches the difference between adequate tools and truly superior ones. Implements with irregular edges or internal flaws are being discarded in favor of better alternatives. The concept of craftsmanship is emerging, along with the pride and satisfaction that comes from creating something that is not just functional, but genuinely well made. Perhaps most remarkably, you're beginning to develop an aesthetic sense about your creations. Tools that are not only effective, but also pleasing to look at and satisfying to hold are being preferred over purely utilitarian alternatives. Symmetry, balance, and elegant proportions are becoming valued qualities that go beyond mere mechanical function. This emergence of aesthetic appreciation represents another cognitive leap of extraordinary significance. You're developing the capacity to find beauty in human-made objects, to appreciate form for its own sake, rather than purely for its practical application. The seeds of art, of creative expression, of the uniquely human drive to create beauty are being planted alongside the more obviously practical innovations of tool technology. The neurological changes supporting these developments are profound and far-reaching. Brain regions associated with fine motor control are expanding and developing new capabilities. Areas responsible for spatial reasoning and three-dimensional visualization are becoming more sophisticated and interconnected. The neural networks that will eventually support complex language are being strengthened through the cognitive demands of toolmaking and teaching. Memory systems are evolving to handle the increasing complexity of technical knowledge. The details of different stone types, the sequences of actions required for various tool designs, the locations of promising raw material sources, all of this information must be stored, organized, and retrieved when needed. Your brain is becoming a sophisticated database of practical knowledge that grows more comprehensive with each passing season. The social transmission of this knowledge is creating the first truly human institutions. Relationships between skilled craftspeople and their apprentices are forming bonds that extend beyond simple family connections. Technical knowledge is being preserved and passed down through generations, creating continuity of tradition that transcends individual lifespans. The foundation is being laid for all the complex educational and cultural institutions that will eventually support human civilization. Competition between groups is intensifying as the advantages provided by superior tool technology become increasingly apparent. Communities with better implements can process resources more efficiently, defend themselves more effectively, and expand into new territories with greater success. This is creating selective pressure for continuous innovation and improvement, driving the pace of technological development ever faster. Your relationship with the environment is changing in fundamental ways. You're no longer simply a creature that adapts to existing conditions through biological evolution, operating over geological timescales. You're becoming something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species that adapts to environmental challenges through cultural evolution, operating within individual lifetimes. When faced with a new problem, a new challenge, a new opportunity, you don't have to wait millions of years for natural selection to provide a biological solution. You can innovate. You can invent. You can create tools and techniques that provide immediate adaptive advantages. This is the birth of human agency, the moment when your species began to take control of its own evolutionary destiny. The psychological impact of this transformation extends deep into your sense of identity and place in the world. You're no longer simply subject to the whims of nature and circumstance. You've become an agent of change, capable of reshaping your environment to better suit your needs. The feeling of empowerment that comes with this realization is both intoxicating and profoundly destabilizing. Your relationship with other species is evolving as well. Animals that had once been competitors or threats are increasingly being viewed as resources to be exploited through superior technology. The tools that allow you to process carcasses more efficiently also make you a more formidable competitor at kill sites, able to drive off scavengers that would have posed serious threats in earlier times. The ecological impact of your innovations is still relatively minimal, but it's growing with each passing generation. Concentrated tool-making activities are beginning to alter local landscapes in subtle but measurable ways. The accumulation of stone chips and broken implements at favoured work sites is creating the first human-made geological formations, markers of your species' growing influence on the physical world. These changes are laying the groundwork for even more dramatic transformations to come. The cognitive abilities and social structures that are emerging from early tool-making will eventually support the conquest of fire, the development of complex language, the creation of representational art, and ultimately, the rise of agricultural civilization. But the path from here to there will be long and challenging, filled with obstacles that will test the limits of human ingenuity and adaptability. Climate change will force your descendants to develop new technologies and survival strategies. Competition with other human species will drive rapid innovation in both tools and social organization. The gradual expansion out of Africa will present environmental challenges that require unprecedented levels of creativity and problem-solving ability. But standing here beside this ancient Ethiopian stream, holding your carefully crafted piece of stone as the last light fades from the western sky, you're simply focused on the immediate present. The tool in your hands represents security, capability, the power to shape the world according to your will. It's a feeling unlike anything your species has ever experienced before. The fire that will eventually warm human hearths around the world was kindled in this moment. The spark of innovation that will carry your descendants to every continent and eventually beyond the boundaries of Earth itself was struck when you first realized that stones didn't have to remain exactly as nature had formed them. The age of technology had truly begun, and the universe would never be the same. As darkness settles over the ancient landscape, you carefully wrap your precious tool in leaves and tuck it close to your body for safekeeping. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to test and refine your innovations. But tonight, you can rest with the satisfaction of having crossed a threshold that no creature had ever crossed before. You've become humanity's first inventor, and the long journey toward the stars has finally begun. But you can't simply wrap up a revolution and call it a night. The moment you tucked that precious tool close to your body, you set in motion forces that would ripple through time in ways that defy comprehension. Because here's what you didn't realize as you drifted off to sleep beside that Ethiopian stream. Your brain wouldn't stop working. Even in dreams, those newly formed neural pathways were firing, consolidating the day's discoveries, preparing for tomorrow's innovations. The next morning brought something unprecedented in the history of your species. You woke up not with the usual immediate panic about survival, but with anticipation, excitement, a burning curiosity to see what else might be possible with these strange new abilities you'd discovered. Your tool was still there, wrapped in its protective leaves, but now you saw it differently, not as a finished product, but as a beginning, a prototype. The other members of your group gathered around as you unwrapped your creation, their eyes bright with an interest that went beyond simple curiosity. They'd spent the night thinking too, their own brains processing what they'd witnessed, imagining possibilities they'd never conceived before. Someone had found a promising piece of stone while foraging yesterday. Another had noticed how certain rocks split when they fell from heights. The collective intelligence of your small community was awakening. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while you were busy revolutionizing tool technology, something else was happening. Something that would prove even more significant in the long run. You were revolutionizing yourselves. The cognitive demands of tool making were reshaping not just your brain, but your entire body. Your hands were developing more precise motor control, your fingers becoming more dexterous, more sensitive to subtle variations in texture and weight. Your eyes were learning to see patterns in stone that had been invisible before, to recognize the telltale signs of good napping material from across a clearing. Your posture was changing too. The need to work with small objects requiring fine manipulation was encouraging a more upright stance, freeing your hands completely from any locomotory function. You were becoming more human with each passing day, not through some mysterious evolutionary force, but through the practical demands of your own innovations. The social dynamics within your group were transforming at an equally rapid pace. Traditional hierarchies based on physical dominance were giving way to more complex arrangements that valued intelligence, creativity, and technical skill. The strongest individual wasn't necessarily the most valuable anymore. The one who could consistently produce the best tools, who could solve problems others couldn't even recognize, that person was becoming indispensable. This shift was creating entirely new forms of cooperation and competition. Individuals were beginning to specialize, not because they were forced to, but because they discovered they had particular aptitudes. One member of your group showed exceptional skill at selecting raw materials, able to spot promising stones that others would overlook. Another developed a talent for the delicate final shaping that turned crude blanks into precision instruments. Knowledge was becoming the most valuable commodity your species had ever encountered. Information about stone types, about techniques, about the subtle tricks that separated successful toolmakers from failures. This knowledge was being hoarded, shared, traded, and stolen, with an intensity that matched any competition for food or territory. But the real breakthrough came when someone in your group made a connection that seems obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary at the time. They realized that the same principles that governed stone napping could be applied to other materials. Wood could be shaped and modified, bone could be carved and pointed, plant fibers could be twisted and woven. The world was full of raw materials just waiting to be transformed by intelligent intervention. This conceptual leap from stone tools to tools in general represented another massive expansion in cognitive capability. You were developing the ability to see underlying principles that transcended specific materials or techniques. Abstract thinking was emerging from practical problem solving, laying the groundwork for all the scientific and mathematical insights that would follow millions of years later. The pace of innovation was accelerating with each successful experiment. What had taken you hours of patient work to accomplish yesterday could be done in minutes today. Techniques that had seemed impossibly difficult last week were becoming routine through practice and refinement. Your small community was experiencing something that wouldn't have a name for millions of years to come, but which we would recognize today as technological progress. Regional variations in tool-making styles were becoming more pronounced as different groups developed their own approaches to common problems. Isolation bred innovation as communities cut off from outside influence were forced to solve challenges independently. But contact between groups created explosive bursts of advancement as techniques and ideas were shared, combined, and improved upon. These early trade networks were becoming increasingly sophisticated, driven not just by the exchange of finished goods, but by the sharing of knowledge itself. A particularly effective technique discovered by one group could spread across vast distances through these networks, refined and adapted by each community that encountered it. Cultural evolution was operating on timescales that made biological evolution seem glacially slow by comparison. Your daily routine was being completely restructured by these technological advances. Tasks that had once consumed the majority of your waking hours could now be accomplished with remarkable efficiency. The time savings were being reinvested in experimentation, in exploration, in the kind of curious investigation that drives further innovation. You were experiencing humanity's first research and development program. The tools themselves were becoming increasingly specialized and sophisticated. General-purpose implements were giving way to highly specific designs optimized for particular tasks. Cutting tools with carefully controlled edge angles, scraping implements with precisely shaped working surfaces, piercing tools with points sharp enough to penetrate the toughest materials. Each design represented a deeper understanding of the relationship between form and function, but perhaps most remarkably, you were beginning to make tools to make tools. Secondary implements that existed not to directly solve survival problems, but to improve the efficiency and quality of the tool-making process itself. Hammerstones selected for their perfect weight and balance. Anvils chosen for their stability and resistance to fracturing. Pressure flakers crafted to remove tiny, precise chips during the final shaping process. This was abstract thinking of the highest order. The ability to see connections between cause and effect across multiple levels of complexity. The recognition that improving your tools for making tools would ultimately improve your ability to solve the practical challenges of daily life. It was thinking about thinking, metacognition in its most primitive but unmistakable form. The neurological changes required to support this level of cognitive sophistication were profound and far-reaching. Your brain was literally rewiring itself to accommodate new ways of processing information. The motor cortex was developing finer control over hand and finger movements. The visual cortex was becoming more adept at recognizing patterns and predicting fracture lines in stone. The prefrontal cortex was expanding its capacity for planning and abstract reasoning. Memory systems were evolving to handle the exponentially increasing complexity of technical knowledge. Information about stone types, tool designs, manufacturing techniques, and quality standards had to be stored, organized, cross-referenced, and retrieved when needed. Your brain was becoming a sophisticated database that could be updated and improved throughout your lifetime. Language, though still primitive by modern standards, was becoming more nuanced and precise as you developed vocabulary for the increasingly complex world of technology you were creating. Words for different types of stone, for various manufacturing techniques, for the subtle qualities that separated excellent tools from merely adequate ones. The language of innovation was being born alongside the innovations themselves. The social implications of these developments extended far beyond simple resource sharing. As communities came together to trade materials and share techniques, they were also exchanging ideas about social organization, about leadership, about the proper relationships between individuals and groups. The technological revolution was driving a social revolution of equal magnitude. Competition between communities was intensifying as the advantages provided by superior technology became impossible to ignore. Groups with better tools could process resources more efficiently, defend themselves more effectively, and expand into new territories with greater confidence. This created relentless pressure for continuous innovation and improvement, driving technological development at an ever-accelerating pace. Your relationship with the environment was undergoing a fundamental transformation. You were no longer simply a creature that adapted to existing conditions through the slow process of biological evolution. You were becoming something unprecedented in Earth's history, a species that could adapt to environmental challenges through technological innovation, operating within individual lifetimes. When faced with new problems, new challenges, new opportunities, you didn't have to wait millions of years for natural selection to provide biological solutions. You could invent, you could create, you could develop tools and techniques that provided immediate adaptive advantages. This was the birth of human agency, the moment when your species began taking active control of its evolutionary destiny. The psychological impact of this transformation was reshaping your entire sense of identity and purpose. You were no longer merely subject to the whims of nature and circumstance. You had become an agent of change, capable of imposing your will upon the physical world in ways that no other species had ever achieved. The feeling of power and control that accompanied this realization was both exhilarating and profoundly unsettling. Your relationship with other species was evolving as well. Animals that had once been competitors or threats were increasingly viewed as resources to be exploited through technological superiority. The tools that enabled more efficient carcass processing also made you formidable competitors at kill sites, capable of driving off scavengers that would have posed serious dangers in earlier times. But the changes went deeper than simple competitive advantage. You were beginning to see the entire natural world through the lens of technological possibility. Trees weren't just sources of fruit or shelter, but potential raw materials for wooden implements. Animal bones weren't just obstacles to accessing marrow, but possible sources of material for specialized tools. Rivers weren't just sources of water, but convenient locations for finding stones polished smooth by flowing water. This technological worldview was fundamentally altering your relationship with the landscape itself. Favorite tool-making locations were being revisited repeatedly, accumulating layers of stone chips and discarded implements that created the first human-made geological formations. These sites were becoming workshops, places where multiple individuals could work side by side, sharing techniques and competing to produce superior implements. The ecological impact of your activities was still minimal by modern standards, but it was growing with each passing season. Concentrated napping activities were beginning to alter local stone distributions. Preferred raw materials were being depleted at some locations while accumulating as finished tools at others. You were beginning to reshape the physical world through your technological activities, creating the first human-modified landscapes. Regional resource management was becoming a concern as communities competed for access to the highest quality stone sources. Territories were being defined not just by traditional hunting and gathering grounds, but by control over valuable raw materials. The politics of technology were emerging alongside the technology itself, creating new forms of conflict and cooperation that would shape human societies for millions of years to come. Quality control was becoming increasingly sophisticated as experience taught the subtle differences between adequate and superior tools. Implements with irregular edges, internal flaws, or poor proportions were being discarded in favor of better alternatives. Standards were rising as craftspeople developed the ability to recognize and appreciate truly exceptional work. The concept of expertise was crystallizing as certain individuals demonstrated consistent ability to produce tools of exceptional quality. These master craftspeople were becoming valued members of their communities, their skills ensuring better access to resources and higher status within group hierarchies. Apprenticeship relationships were forming as younger individuals sought instruction from acknowledged experts. Innovation was becoming a conscious, deliberate process, rather than a matter of accidental discovery. Experienced toolmakers were actively experimenting with new techniques, testing different approaches, systematically exploring the boundaries of what was possible with available materials and methods. The scientific method was being born from practical necessity, though it would be millions of years before anyone gave it a name. Documentation, in its most primitive form, was beginning to appear as successful techniques were preserved through demonstration and practice, rather than being lost when their discoverers died. Knowledge was becoming cumulative, with each generation building upon the achievements of their predecessors rather than starting from scratch. Cultural evolution was accelerating beyond anything the biological world had ever witnessed. The ripple effects of these changes were spreading far beyond the immediate practical benefits of better tools. The cognitive abilities required for successful toolmaking were creating neural foundations that would eventually support language, art, music, mathematics, and all the other distinctly human capabilities that set your species apart from every other form of life on Earth. Social cooperation was reaching new levels of sophistication as communities organized themselves around the complex tasks of tool production and knowledge transmission. Division of labor was emerging not through biological specialization, but through individual choice and aptitude. The foundations were being laid for all the complex social institutions that would eventually support human civilization. Trade relationships were extending across increasingly vast distances as communities sought access to the highest quality raw materials and most advanced techniques. These networks were creating the first truly human economic systems, based not on simple resource sharing, but on the creation and exchange of value through technological transformation of raw materials. Cultural identity was beginning to coalesce around technological traditions as different communities developed distinctive styles and approaches to toolmaking. Regional variations in design and technique were becoming markers of group membership, creating the earliest forms of what we might recognize as cultural expression and artistic style. The future was becoming imaginable for the first time in the history of life on Earth. Your ability to envision improvements, to plan modifications, to anticipate the results of experimental techniques, all of these capabilities were creating a temporal perspective that extended beyond the immediate present into a realm of possibility and potential that had never existed before. Standing there in that ancient Ethiopian landscape, carefully examining the edge of your latest creation while your mind raced with ideas for further improvements, you couldn't possibly comprehend the magnitude of what you had set in motion. The spark of innovation that had been kindled with that first intentional modification of stone was already beginning to burn with an intensity that would eventually illuminate the entire universe. The age of technology was no longer just beginning. It was accelerating, gathering momentum with each passing day, each successful experiment, each breakthrough in understanding. The journey from stone tools to space travel had begun in earnest, and there would be no slowing down, no turning back, no rest until your species had explored every possibility that intelligence and determination could reveal. But the revolution you'd started wasn't confined to your small band of innovators. Word travels fast when survival itself hangs in the balance, and news of these miraculous stone implements was spreading across the landscape like wildfire. Other groups, drawn by curiosity and desperation in equal measure, were making pilgrimages to witness these technological marvels firsthand. Picture the scene as delegations from neighboring communities arrived at your toolmaking sites. They came bearing gifts, hoping to trade for finished implements or, even more valuable, for instruction in the mysterious arts of stone shaping. These gatherings were becoming the first international conferences in human history, though of course you had no words for such concepts yet. The knowledge exchange happening at these meetings was explosive in its intensity and consequences. Techniques that had taken your group months to develop were being transmitted to dozens of other communities within days. But here's the fascinating part. Each group didn't simply copy what they observed. They adapted it, modified it, improved upon it based on their own local conditions and available materials. A community from the highlands brought with them experience working with different types of volcanic rock. Their techniques for dealing with these harder, more brittle materials added entirely new dimensions to your understanding of stoneworking. a group from the river valleys had discovered that certain water-worn pebbles made superior hammerstones, their smooth surfaces providing better grip and more controlled striking. These cross-cultural exchanges were creating something unprecedented in the natural world. Hybrid technologies that combined innovations from multiple sources, creating tools and techniques that no single community could have developed in isolation. The pace of advancement wasn't just accelerating, it was compounding, with each new combination of ideas sparking further innovations. Your brain was struggling to keep up with the flood of new information. The neural pathways that had seemed so revolutionary just weeks ago were being constantly rewired, expanded, and interconnected as you processed techniques and concepts that challenged everything you thought you knew about working with stone. The cognitive load was enormous, but somehow your expanding mental capacity was rising to meet it. Sleep was becoming restless as your mind churned through the day's discoveries, testing new approaches, visualizing potential improvements, planning tomorrow's experiments. Dreams were filled with images of flying stone chips, perfect edges emerging from chaos, the satisfying crack of successful fractures. Your subconscious had become a research laboratory operating around the clock. The social dynamics of these intergroup gatherings were as complex as the technological exchanges. Status hierarchies from different communities clashed and merged as individuals established their credentials through demonstrations of skill. Friendships formed across tribal boundaries, united by shared fascination with the emerging world of technology. Rivalries developed as master craftspeople competed to produce the most impressive demonstrations of their abilities. Romance was blooming too, as young people from different groups found themselves drawn together by mutual appreciation for each other's technical skills. These relationships were creating genetic exchange between previously isolated populations. But more importantly for our story, they were creating even more extensive networks for the transmission of technological knowledge. Children born from these unions would grow up bilingual in the emerging languages of technology, fluent in multiple traditions of tool making, capable of combining techniques in ways their parents could never have imagined. They were becoming the first generation of truly cosmopolitan humans, citizens of a technological world that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a local innovation in a single Ethiopian valley was becoming a species-wide transformation that would reshape the entire trajectory of human evolution. The rate of change was accelerating beyond anything the biological world had ever witnessed, driven by the unique human capacity for cultural learning and transmission. But with rapid change came new challenges and unexpected consequences. Communities that had once coexisted peacefully were now finding themselves in competition for access to the best tool-making materials and most skilled craftspeople. Traditional territories were being redefined around technological resources rather than simple hunting and gathering grounds. Conflicts were erupting as groups with superior tools began expanding into territories previously controlled by less technologically advanced neighbors. The same implements that made processing animal carcasses more efficient also made excellent weapons for defending resources or taking them from others. Technology was proving to be a double-edged sword in the most literal sense. Your own group was facing difficult decisions about how to respond to these changing conditions. The knowledge you had developed through months of patient experimentation was now your most valuable possession, more precious than any traditional resource. Should it be shared freely for the benefit of all, hoarded for competitive advantage, or traded selectively for other valuable considerations? Different members of your community held different opinions about these questions, creating internal tensions that had never existed before. Some argued for open sharing, believing that technological advancement benefited everyone and that cooperation was more valuable than competition. Others insisted on maintaining secrecy, fearing that sharing knowledge would eliminate the advantages your group had worked so hard to develop. These debates were creating the first ethical dilemmas in human history. Questions about intellectual property, about the responsibilities that come with superior knowledge, about the proper balance between individual achievement and communal benefit. Philosophy was being born from practical necessity, though it would be millions of years before anyone called it that. The tool-making process itself was becoming increasingly sophisticated as techniques developed through trial and error were systematized and refined. What had once been an intuitive process guided by feel and instinct was becoming a precise craft governed by understood principles and established procedures. Raw material selection was evolving into a science of its own. You were learning to read the subtle signs that indicated a stone's internal structure, to predict how force would travel through different crystalline matrices, to anticipate where fractures would occur and how they could be controlled. The geology knowledge you were accumulating would have impressed modern academics. Preparation techniques were becoming more elaborate as you discovered that proper setup could dramatically improve the efficiency and quality of the knapping process. Work surfaces were being carefully selected and prepared. Hammerstones were being modified to provide better grip and more precise control. Anvils were being positioned to take advantage of optimal angles and leverage. The striking techniques themselves were becoming increasingly nuanced as you learned to vary force, angle, and timing to achieve specific results. Light taps for detailed edge work, heavy blows for initial roughing, glancing strikes for controlling fracture propagation. Each technique required its own specialized motor patterns, its own muscle memory developed through countless repetitions. Quality assessment was becoming more rigorous as your standards rose with your capabilities. Tools that would have seemed miraculous just months ago were now being discarded as substandard when compared to the best work being produced by master craftspeople. The concept of excellence was emerging from practical necessity. Innovation was accelerating as successful techniques were combined in new ways and applied to different materials and purposes. The basic principles of controlled fracture that had been discovered through stoneworking were being adapted to bone carving, wood shaping, and even the processing of plant materials for cordage and basketry. Specialization was becoming more pronounced as individuals discovered particular aptitudes and focused their efforts on developing specific skills. Some became expert at selecting and preparing raw materials. Others specialized in the rough shaping of blanks. Still others focused on the delicate finish work that transformed crude implements into precision instruments. Teaching was evolving from simple demonstration to structured instruction, as master craftspeople developed systematic approaches to transmitting their knowledge to apprentices. The relationship between teacher and student was becoming formalized with established expectations and responsibilities on both sides. Documentation was beginning to appear in its most primitive forms as successful techniques were preserved through repeated demonstration and practice rather than being lost when their discoverers died. Knowledge was becoming cumulative, building upon itself generation after generation rather than starting fresh with each individual. The economic implications were profound as toolmaking created the first true value-added industries in human history. Raw materials that were common and essentially worthless could be transformed through skill and labor into implements that commanded significant trade value. The concept of manufacturing was being born. Trade networks were expanding rapidly as communities specialized in different aspects of tool production and sought to exchange their products for materials and techniques they couldn't produce locally. These early commercial relationships were creating the foundation for all the complex economic systems that would eventually support human civilization. Cultural identity was coalescing around technological traditions as different communities developed distinctive styles and approaches to toolmaking. Regional variations in design and technique were becoming markers of group membership, sources of pride and identity that transcended simple tribal affiliations. The environmental impact was growing as intensive toolmaking activities began to alter local landscapes in measurable ways. Favored knapping sites were accumulating thick deposits of stone chips and broken implements. preferred raw material sources were showing signs of systematic exploitation. Humans were beginning to reshape the physical world through their technological activities. Population dynamics were shifting as communities with superior tools gained advantages in resource acquisition and processing. These groups could support larger populations, expand into new territories, and survive environmental challenges that devastated their less technologically advanced neighbours. Natural selection was beginning to favour intelligence and innovation over purely physical traits. Cognitive development was accelerating as the complex demands of tool-making drove the evolution of enhanced mental capabilities. Brain regions associated with fine motor control, spatial reasoning, and abstract thinking were expanding and becoming more interconnected. Intelligence was becoming the primary adaptive advantage for your species. Social cooperation was reaching new levels of sophistication as communities organized themselves around the complex tasks of tool production and knowledge transmission. Leadership roles were emerging based on technical expertise rather than simply physical dominance or traditional authority. The future was becoming imaginable for the first time in Earth's history, as your ability to plan improvements and anticipate results created a temporal perspective that extended beyond immediate survival needs. Long-term thinking was developing from practical necessity as tool makers learned to prepare for seasonal changes and anticipate future requirements. Art was beginning to emerge from craftsmanship as tool makers developed aesthetic preferences that went beyond mere functionality. Symmetry, balance, and elegant proportions were becoming valued qualities that enhanced the appeal and trade value of finished implements. Beauty was being born alongside utility. Language was evolving to accommodate the expanding vocabulary needed for technical communication. Words for different stone types, manufacturing techniques, quality standards, and tool functions were being created and refined. The terminology of technology was developing alongside the technology itself. Memory systems were being challenged to handle the exponentially increasing complexity of technical knowledge. Information about materials, techniques, locations, and individuals had to be stored, organized, and retrieved when needed. Your brain was becoming a sophisticated database of practical information. Problem-solving abilities were being honed through constant exposure to technical challenges that demanded creative solutions. Each failed experiment provided learning opportunities. Each successful innovation suggested new possibilities for exploration. Critical thinking was developing from practical necessity. The ripple effects were spreading beyond tool-making into every aspect of human existence. The cognitive capabilities required for successful stoneworking were creating neural foundations that would eventually support language, mathematics, art, music, and all the other distinctly human achievements that would follow. Standing there in that ancient landscape, surrounded by the debris of countless experiments and innovations, you had no way of knowing that you were witnessing the birth of human civilization itself. The spark of intentional modification that had begun with that first, deliberately shaped stone was already growing into a flame that would eventually illuminate the entire universe. The transformation was irreversible now. There would be no going back to the simple existence of your ancestors, who had lived in harmony with nature's rhythms, without feeling the need to improve upon them. You had opened a door that could never be closed, started a process that would never end, lit a fire that would burn until the stars themselves grew cold. The age of technology was no longer dawning. It had arrived in full force, and its momentum was building toward achievements that would have seemed like magic to your earlier ancestors. The long journey from stone tools to space travel was well underway, and nothing would ever be the same again. But even as you marveled at how far you'd come from those first tentative strikes beside the Ethiopian stream, you sensed that this was still just the beginning. The real adventures lay ahead, in the countless generations of innovation and discovery that would build upon the foundation you were laying, with each carefully crafted blow, each precisely aimed strike, each moment of creative inspiration that pushed the boundaries of what was possible ever further into the unknown. The implications of what you had unleashed were rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. But these waves were traveling not just through space, but through time itself. Each successful innovation was creating new possibilities that your ancestors could never have imagined, while simultaneously closing off evolutionary paths that had seemed inevitable just generations before. Your species was diverging from every other form of life on Earth at an accelerating pace. While other animals continued to adapt through the slow grind of genetic change operating over millions of years, you had discovered something far more powerful: cultural evolution. The ability to pass along learned behaviors, refined techniques, and accumulated knowledge from one generation to the next through teaching rather than breeding. This meant that a clever innovation developed by a single individual could spread through an entire population within decades rather than millennia. A breakthrough in tool design could transform the survival prospects of thousands of individuals who had never even met the original inventor. Knowledge was becoming immortal in a way that individual lives could never be. The psychological transformation accompanying these technological advances was perhaps even more profound than the practical benefits. Your sense of identity was shifting from that of a creature subject to natural forces beyond your control, to something unprecedented in Earth's history, an agent of deliberate change, a being capable of imposing intention upon the chaos of the natural world. This newfound sense of agency was intoxicating, but it came with unexpected burdens. For the first time in your species' existence, you were faced with choices that carried moral weight. When you developed a new technique that could provide advantages to your group, did you have an obligation to share it with neighboring communities who might be struggling to survive? When your superior tools allowed you to process resources more efficiently, did that give you the right to expand into territories traditionally controlled by others? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were practical dilemmas that demanded immediate answers, as your innovations created power imbalances that had never existed before in the natural world. Groups with better technology could support larger populations, defend themselves more effectively, and expand into new territories with greater success. The technological divide was becoming a survival issue that couldn't be ignored. Your daily routine had been completely transformed by these advances. Tasks that had once required the coordinated efforts of your entire group could now be accomplished by a single individual equipped with the right tools. Bones that had previously been impenetrable fortresses protecting valuable marrow could be cracked open in seconds. Tough plant fibers that had resisted all attempts at processing could be cut and shaped with ease. This efficiency revolution was creating something your species had never experienced before. Leisure time. Moments when the immediate demands of survival had been met, and you could turn your attention to other pursuits. These precious intervals were being filled with experimentation, with play, with the kind of curious exploration that drives further innovation. You found yourself napping stones, not because you needed more tools immediately, but because the process itself had become intrinsically rewarding. The satisfaction of seeing your vision take shape under the controlled application of force. The pleasure of creating something beautiful as well as functional. The pride that came from mastering a complex skill that others found challenging. Art was being born from craftsmanship as your aesthetic sense developed alongside your technical abilities. Tools weren't just evaluated for their effectiveness anymore. Symmetry mattered. Balance was important. Elegant proportions enhanced both the functionality and the appeal of finished implements. You were developing standards of beauty that went far beyond mere utility. The social implications of these changes were reshaping the very foundations of human community. Traditional hierarchies based on physical strength or genetic inheritance were giving way to more complex arrangements that valued intelligence, creativity, and technical skill. The individual who could consistently produce superior tools was becoming as important to group survival as the strongest hunter or the most charismatic leader. knowledge was emerging as a new form of wealth that could be accumulated, invested, and transmitted across generations. Unlike traditional resources that were consumed when used, technical knowledge actually grew more valuable when shared, creating network effects that benefited entire communities. The more people who understood advanced techniques, the faster those techniques could be refined and improved. This was creating entirely new forms of social cooperation, as communities organized themselves around the complex tasks of tool production and knowledge transmission. Specialization was emerging as individuals discovered particular aptitudes and focused their efforts on developing specific expertise. Some became masters of raw material selection. Others specialized in rough shaping. Still others focused on the delicate finish work that separated good tools from truly exceptional ones. Apprenticeship relationships were forming as experienced craftspeople took on students eager to learn advanced techniques. These bonds often transcended traditional family structures, creating new forms of social connection based on shared interest and mutual benefit, rather than blood relation or tribal affiliation. The pace of innovation was accelerating as successful techniques were combined in novel ways and applied to new materials and purposes. The basic principles of controlled fracture that had been discovered through stoneworking were being adapted to bone carving, antler shaping, and wood processing. Cross-disciplinary thinking was emerging as craftspeople recognized underlying patterns that connected seemingly different activities. Regional variations were becoming more pronounced as different communities developed their own distinctive approaches to common challenges. Isolation bred innovation as groups cut off from outside influence were forced to solve problems independently. But contact between communities created explosive bursts of advancement as techniques and ideas were shared, combined, and improved upon. Trade networks were expanding rapidly as communities saw access to the highest quality raw materials and most advanced techniques. These early commercial relationships were creating the first truly human economic systems, based not on simple resource sharing, but on the creation and exchange of value through technological transformation. The concept of intellectual property was beginning to emerge as craftspeople struggled with questions about who owned particular techniques and under what circumstances they should be shared. These issues were creating new forms of conflict and cooperation as communities navigated the balance between competitive advantage and collective benefit. Quality control was becoming increasingly sophisticated as experience taught the subtle differences between adequate and superior tools. Standards were rising as craftspeople developed the ability to recognize and appreciate truly exceptional work. The concept of excellence was crystallizing from practical necessity. Documentation was appearing in its most primitive forms, as successful techniques were preserved through systematic demonstration and practice, rather than being lost when their discoverers died. Knowledge was becoming cumulative, with each generation building upon the achievements of their predecessors, rather than starting from zero. The cognitive demands of advanced toolmaking were driving rapid evolution in brain structure and function. Neural pathways were being strengthened and expanded to support the complex motor control required for precise stone knapping. Visual processing systems were becoming more sophisticated as craftspeople learned to recognize subtle patterns in raw materials that predicted their working properties. Memory systems were evolving to handle the exponentially increasing complexity of technical knowledge. Information about stone types, manufacturing sequences, quality standards, and individual techniques had to be stored, organized, cross-referenced, and retrieved when needed. Your brain was becoming a sophisticated database that could be updated and enhanced throughout your lifetime. Language was developing to accommodate the expanding vocabulary needed for technical communication. Words for different fracture patterns, edge geometries, working techniques, and material properties were being created and refined. The terminology of technology was evolving alongside the technology itself. Problem-solving abilities were being honed through constant exposure to technical challenges that demanded creative solutions. Each failed experiment provided learning opportunities. Each successful innovation suggested new possibilities for exploration. Critical thinking skills were developing from practical necessity as craftspeople learned to analyze problems systematically and test solutions methodically. The environmental impact of your activities was growing as intensive tool-making operations began to alter local landscapes in measurable ways. Favored napping sites were accumulating thick deposits of stone debris that would persist in the archaeological record for millions of years. These locations were becoming workshops where multiple individuals could collaborate on complex projects. Resource management was becoming a concern as communities competed for access to the highest quality raw materials. Territories were being redefined around technological resources rather than traditional hunting and gathering grounds. The politics of innovation were emerging alongside the innovations themselves. Population dynamics were shifting as groups with superior technology gained decisive advantages in resource acquisition and processing. These communities could support larger populations, expand into new territories more successfully, and survive environmental challenges that devastated their less technologically advanced neighbors. Your relationship with other species was evolving as technological superiority transformed you from just another competing animal into something unprecedented. Predators that had once been serious threats were becoming manageable problems that could be addressed through better tools and techniques. Prey animals were becoming more accessible as improved processing methods extracted maximum value from each kill. The ecological niche your species occupied was expanding rapidly as technological capabilities opened up new opportunities and environments that had previously been inaccessible. Territories that had been marginal for traditional foraging were becoming valuable when approached with the right tools and techniques. Climate resilience was improving as technological solutions provided alternatives to purely biological adaptations. When environmental conditions changed, you could respond with new tools and techniques rather than waiting for genetic adaptations that might take thousands of generations to emerge. The concept of progress was crystallizing as you developed the ability to compare current capabilities with past limitations and envision future improvements. Linear thinking about technological development was emerging from the cyclical patterns that had dominated pre-technological existence. Long-term planning was becoming possible as your enhanced ability to predict and control outcomes extended your temporal perspective beyond immediate survival needs. Seasonal preparation was becoming more sophisticated as you learned to anticipate challenges and develop solutions in advance. Risk management was evolving as you gained better understanding of the relationship between technological choices and their consequences. The ability to model potential outcomes before committing to particular approaches was reducing the costs of experimentation and accelerating the pace of innovation. Innovation was becoming a conscious, deliberate process rather than a matter of accidental discovery. Experienced toolmakers were actively experimenting with new approaches, systematically exploring the boundaries of what was possible with available materials and methods. The scientific method was emerging from practical necessity. Cultural identity was coalescing around technological traditions as different communities developed distinctive styles and approaches that became markers of group membership. Regional variations in technique and design were creating the earliest forms of what we might recognize as artistic expression and cultural heritage. The future was becoming imaginable for the first time in Earth's history, as your ability to envision improvements and plan modifications created a temporal perspective that extended far beyond the present moment into realms of possibility that had never existed before. Standing there in that ancient landscape, your hands stained with the dust of countless stone-working sessions, your mind racing with ideas for further improvements, you represented something entirely new in the history of consciousness. Not just an animal that used tools, but a being that created technology. Not just a creature that adapted to environmental challenges, but one that reshaped the environment to meet its needs. The spark of innovation that had been kindled with that first intentional modification of stone was now burning with an intensity that would eventually illuminate the entire cosmos. The journey from crude choppers to spacecraft was well underway, driven by the same fundamental human capacity for creative problem solving that you had discovered beside that Ethiopian stream. But you couldn't know any of this as you carefully examined the latest product of your skill, testing its edge against your thumb, feeling the perfect balance of weight and proportion that spoke of mastery achieved through countless hours of practice and refinement. You were simply focused on the immediate challenge of making tomorrow's tools even better than today's. The revolution you had started was no longer contained within your small community. It was spreading across continents, carried by trade networks and migration patterns that were themselves being transformed by technological capabilities. The age of purely natural human existence was ending, replaced by something unprecedented in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. Your species had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The long journey toward becoming the dominant force shaping planetary evolution had begun in earnest, and every carefully placed strike of stone against stone was carrying you further down that path toward a destiny that would have seemed impossible to imagine just a few short years before. The transformation wasn't happening in isolation. Across the vast expanse of ancient Africa, in valleys and highlands separated by hundreds of miles, other groups were making similar discoveries. The cognitive leap that had occurred beside that Ethiopian stream was being replicated by minds that had never met, never shared knowledge, never even suspected that others like them existed. This parallel evolution of technology represents one of the most remarkable aspects of human innovation: the capacity for independent invention, for multiple individuals to arrive at similar solutions through their own processes of experimentation and discovery. It suggests that what you had accomplished wasn't a fluke, wasn't a singular moment of inspiration that might never have occurred again. It was an inevitable consequence of the cognitive architecture that evolution had been building in your species for millions of years. Picture the scene unfolding simultaneously across dozens of locations. A group near what we now call the Rift Valley discovers that certain volcanic glasses fracture in predictable patterns. A community in the highlands learns that quartzite can be heat-treated to improve its knapping properties. A band near ancient lake shores finds that water-worn cobbles make superior hammer stones. Each discovery emerges from local conditions and available materials, yet all point toward the same fundamental breakthrough. The convergent nature of these innovations tells us something profound about the human mind at this crucial juncture in our species' development. Your brains had reached a tipping point, a level of complexity and connectivity that made technological thinking not just possible, but virtually inevitable. The neural networks required for abstract reasoning, for cause and effect analysis, for the mental modeling of three-dimensional transformations had all reached sufficient sophistication to support deliberate tool manufacture. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. These parallel discoveries weren't remaining isolated for long. Human mobility, even 3.5 million years ago, was greater than we might expect. Groups moved seasonally to follow resources, to escape harsh weather, to find new territories when population pressures mounted. And with this movement came contact, exchange, and the rapid spread of innovations across vast distances. The mechanisms of technological transmission were remarkably efficient, despite the absence of any formal communication systems. A single skilled toolmaker joining a new group could transform their entire technological repertoire within a single season. A chance encounter between traveling bands could result in knowledge transfer that revolutionized both communities' capabilities. Even hostile interactions, raids, and conflicts often resulted in the spread of superior techniques as captured tools were reverse engineered and reproduced. Your own group was beginning to encounter evidence of these parallel developments. Abandoned campsites revealed stone chips, that showed napping techniques subtly different from your own. Trade objects appeared that had been manufactured using methods you didn't recognize. Strangers arrived with tools that achieved familiar functions through entirely novel approaches. These encounters were simultaneously exciting and unsettling. Exciting because they revealed new possibilities, different solutions to common problems, innovative approaches that could be adapted and incorporated into your own technological repertoire. Unsettling because they challenged the assumption that your group's methods represented the pinnacle of achievement, that you had discovered the best possible ways of working stone. Competition was intensifying as communities with different technological traditions came into contact. Groups that had developed superior techniques held significant advantages in resource processing, territorial expansion, and survival during challenging periods. Natural selection was beginning to operate not just on individual traits, but on cultural innovations that could spread through populations faster than genetic changes. This cultural evolution was creating feedback loops that accelerated the pace of technological development beyond anything the biological world had ever witnessed. Successful innovations spread rapidly through populations, creating larger groups of skilled practitioners who could build upon and refine the original discoveries. Failed experiments were quickly abandoned, preventing the waste of time and resources on unproductive approaches. The social dynamics surrounding technological innovation were becoming increasingly complex. Master craftspeople were gaining status and influence that transcended traditional tribal hierarchies. Their knowledge was valuable not just to their immediate families or clans, but to entire regional networks of communities seeking access to advanced techniques. And so we return to you, standing there in that ancient Ethiopian landscape, your calloused hands wrapped around a piece of stone that has been forever transformed by your will and intention. The weight of it feels different now, doesn't it? Not just as an object, but as a bridge between what was and what could be. You've crossed a threshold that no creature in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth had ever crossed before. You've become humanity's first inventor, and in doing so, you've lit a fire that will burn until the stars themselves grow cold. Every innovation that follows, from the conquest of fire to the exploration of space, traces its lineage back to this moment, to this place, to your revolutionary realization that the world doesn't have to remain exactly as you found it.